Welcome to the Deep Dive. I am so incredibly hyped for this one because what we are getting into today is just massive. It is huge. I mean, a total disaster on an unbelievable scale. But before we get into the substance of what we're covering today, I have to state this right up front, mandatory disclaimer. This is not financial advice.
Right, definitely not.
We are exploring deep economic history today so that we can understand the mechanics of past crises. But nothing discussed here constitutes financial advice. Period.
Exactly, just history today.
Okay, so the subject we are getting into today is monumental. It's the ultimate black swan event. We're looking at the 1929 Great Depression. And honestly, the sheer scale of the financial devastation is staggering.
It really rewired the entire world.
Right, the amount of wealth that just evaporated almost overnight completely rewired global economics. And for this, we have pulled from a massive stack of sources. We've got primary historical documents, Federal Reserve records, transcripts from Senate hearings, and some really dense economic retrospectives.
A lot of heavy reading for this one.
A ton. But we did it to arm you, the listener, with 5 of the most bizarre, mind-bending curly tales from the crash. Because the mission today is to give you the ultimate historical playbook.
Yeah, we want to equip you with the deep context and these really profound stories.
So you can go to a social event or the pub and just completely captivate the room. You can show your friends exactly how fragile the financial system truly is.
Yeah.
Because while millions were facing absolute utter ruin, a select few were pulling the levers behind the scenes.
And looking at the winners and the losers of 1929 offers just this incredible masterclass in human psychology and market mechanics. It remains the defining economic catastrophe of the 20th century.
Unbelievable scope.
The contraction was so violent. You've had industrial production dropping by half, global trade just plummeting. Unemployment hit 25% in the U.S. and went even higher in heavily industrialized European nations.
A quarter of the country out of work.
Yeah, it shattered the seemingly invincible optimism of the Roaring Twenties. And exploring these specific, strange anomalies doesn't just give us fun trivia, it gives us an incredible diagnostic window into the structural failures and the intense psychological panic of a systemic collapse.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to properly set the stage in the late 1920s first, because the atmosphere is totally electric.
It was a boom time.
A massive boom time. You have the explosion of jazz, commercial aviation is just taking off, automobiles are rolling off Henry Ford's assembly lines at record speed.
Radio's broadcasting into almost every American home.
Right, technology is booming. But beneath all those marvels, there was this unprecedented, completely debt-fueled stock market boom. The Dow Jones Industrial Average surged from 63 points in 1921 all the way to 381 by September 1929.
A 6-fold increase.
Staggering.
Yeah.
The euphoria was so blinding that prominent figures like the highly respected economist Irving Fisher, he publicly proclaimed that stock prices had reached what looked like a permanently high plateau.
He actually said that out loud.
In public. The prevailing thought was that the business cycle had been conquered. But when the music finally stopped, the carnage was absolute. Which leads me to one of the most fascinating figures of the era and our first crazy tale.
Jesse Livermore.
Yes. I've read so much about this guy, the trader they called the Boy Plunger. While the entire world was bleeding out and losing their shirts on Black Tuesday, October 29, 1929, he somehow walked away with an absolute fortune.
He was betting against the grain.
Big time. The famous anecdote is that he returned home on October 29th, and his wife, Dorothy, was in a state of sheer panic.
She thought they were wiped out.
Completely wiped out. She had actually moved all their custom furniture out of the house because she assumed the bailiffs were coming to seize their assets right then and there.
Just waiting for the knock on the door.
Exactly. So Livermore walks into this totally empty house and casually informs her that he had just made $100 million, which translates to billions in today's purchasing power.
Billy.
It's bananas.
Yeah.
How on earth did he orchestrate that? He was betting against the market, but how did he do it without the broader market catching on and squeezing him out?
Well, the mechanics of Livermore's 1929 operation are a masterclass in covert market positioning. To execute a bet of that scale, you can't simply walk into a single brokerage and say, hey, I want to short the entire market.
Because everyone would see it.
Right. The market would immediately sense the immense downward pressure, and counterparties would rally to squeeze his position. So Livermore operated through a vast, decentralized network of proxy brokers and bucket shops.
So he was hiding his tracks.
Exactly. He deliberately fragmented his trades, placing smaller, seemingly disconnected orders across dozens of different firms in various cities. He was essentially hiding his massive footprint in the noise of the euphoric buying.
Wow.
He recognized that the market was exhibiting all the classic symptoms of a late-stage speculative bubble.
Let's break that down for people who might not be deep into finance.
Mm.
What exactly is a speculative bubble in simple terms?
A speculative bubble is essentially when people buy things purely because the price is going up, not based on any actual underlying value. It's like a massive game of musical chairs.
Everyone assumes they'll find a chair before the music stops.
Precisely. They buy a stock not because the company is making great profits, but because they think some other guy will pay even more for it tomorrow. It becomes totally divorced from corporate fundamentals.
And he was shorting this bubble.
Yes. Shorting is basically betting the price will go down. You borrow stock from someone else, sell it immediately at the current high price, wait for the crash, and then buy the stock back for pennies to return it to the lender.
And you keep the massive difference.
Exactly.
I often hear people debate whether Livermore was a genuine macroeconomic genius or simply a reckless gambler who got remarkably lucky on his timing. Where does the evidence actually point?
It's a crucial distinction. We shouldn't romanticize him as an infallible oracle. He was brilliantly analytical, yes, but his strategies carried immense, almost existential risks.
Because if the market kept going up, he'd be ruined.
Absolutely ruined. What made Livermore successful in 1929 was his acute understanding of leverage fragility.
Right, the margin loans.
The margin requirements of the era were notoriously lax. Investors were routinely putting down only 10% of the capital required to purchase equities.
Meaning they borrowed $90 for every $10 they actually had.
Exactly. They borrowed the remaining 90% from their brokerages. Livermore didn't just look at the stock prices. He looked at the structural architecture supporting those prices.
The house of cards.
Right. He understood that a 10% margin ratio meant that even a minor localized correction could trigger a cascade of forced liquidations. And there were no regulatory circuit breakers in 1929.
No automated halts in trading.
None. Today, if the market crashes too fast, trading pauses to let people catch their breath. Back then, nothing. Once the selling started, the ticker tape machines fell hours behind the actual trading floor prices.
So nobody even knew what the actual price was.
Traders were completely flying blind. Livermore mathematically calculated that the leverage was so overextended that once gravity took hold, the lack of circuit breakers would allow the market to continuously gap downward, hour by hour.
The psychological pressure of holding that short position while everyone else is screaming that the market is going up forever must have been insane.
Oh, immense pressure.
But he wasn't the only one who saw the writing on the wall. And this leads us to tale number 2, which is one of my absolute favorites. The legendary pub story involving Joseph Kennedy, the patriarch of the Kennedy family, JFK's dad.
The shoeshine boy indicator.
Yes. The story goes that he liquidated his massive equity portfolio right before the crash, effectively saving his empire.
Yeah.
And the catalyst wasn't some complex algorithmic model. It wasn't an insider tip from a smoky boardroom.
It was a kid on the street.
A shoeshine boy. A 10-year-old kid with a rag and a brush looking up at one of the wealthiest men in America and offering him unsolicited stock tips, telling him to buy Chrysler and Steel.
Just giving him investment advice while buffing his shoes.
Right. And Kennedy supposedly walked away realizing that if the shoeshine boy is heavily invested in giving tips, the top is definitively in.
It's a great story.
It is. But beyond the folklore of that moment, what is the actual liquidity dynamic happening there? Why is that specific market sentiment indicator so fatal for a bull market?
It goes directly to the mechanics of marginal demand. Market sentiment is just the general mood of the crowd.
Are people greedy or are they scared?
Exactly. In any asset bubble, the upward trajectory of prices requires a constant, accelerating influx of new capital. The sophisticated institutional money enters early, then the wealthy retail investors follow.
The doctors, the lawyers.
Right. And as the momentum builds, it begins to draw in demographics that traditionally have zero exposure to financial markets. In the 1920s, you saw the proliferation of investment trusts and layaway stock purchasing plans specifically designed to extract capital from the working class.
Getting everyone involved.
When a shoeshine boy or a taxi driver or a baker is fully invested and bragging about gains, it represents the absolute saturation of the capital pool. There is quite literally no marginal buyer left in the economy to bid the price higher.
Because every single available dollar has already been sucked into the vacuum.
Precisely. And when there is no new money entering the system, the price stalls. In a market built on 90% leverage, a stalled price is just as dangerous as a falling price.
Because of the interest on the borrowed money.
Yes, the carrying costs of that debt begin to weigh heavily on the investor. The moment the price ticks down even a little, the equity buffer of those heavily leveraged retail accounts evaporates. This triggers the margin call.
Okay, let's define margin call clearly for the audience.
A margin call is when you buy on margin with borrowed money, and the price drops so much that your broker demands you deposit more cash immediately to cover the risk.
And if you don't have the cash,
If you don't have the cash, the broker forcefully liquidates your position. They sell your stock at whatever the market price is, taking a massive loss to get their money back.
which drives the price down even further.
Exactly. It drives the price down and triggers the next tier of margin calls for the people who borrowed slightly less. Kennedy recognized that the shoeshine boy wasn't just a sign of exuberance, he was the mathematical proof of zero remaining liquidity.
I think about how that translates to the modern investor tuning into this deep dive today. Think about modern FOMO, the fear of missing out.
It's exactly the same mechanism.
We have incredibly advanced algorithmic trading today, high-frequency millimeter wave networks, but human psychology is remarkably static. When you look at modern speculative manias, whether it's the meme stock phenomena we saw recently or highly speculative altcoins or even certain sectors of the tech market, we see the exact same behavioral patterns.
The underlying emotional drive hasn't changed.
Not at all. The delivery mechanism is a viral social media post or a push notification on your phone rather than a shoeshine stand, but the liquidity drain is identical.
The parallels are profound. The velocity of information has increased exponentially, but the cognitive biases driving the herd remain unchanged. Modern retail apps have gamified the investment experience.
Making it super easy to trade options on your couch.
Right, much like the bucket shops of the 1920s lowered the barrier to entry back then. When you see a saturation of retail exuberance fueled by high levels of margin debt today, the vulnerability to a sudden, violent correction is structurally identical to the conditions Kennedy observed in 1929.
So Livermore and Kennedy navigate the peak. They see the warning signs and they get out. But what happens to the institutional foundation of the country once the downward cascade actually starts?
That's when the real panic sets in.
And this brings us to tale number 3. I want to examine one of the most peculiar and disastrous dominoes to fall during the early stages of the Depression. In December 1930, we see the largest single bank failure in American history up to that point.
The Bank of the United States.
Yes. But what's wild to me is that it was just a private commercial bank in New York, operated by two men, Bernard Marcus and Saul Singer.
Two regular businessmen.
Right. The issue was their name. They called it the Bank of the United States. I've read that this specific naming choice turned what should have been a contained local insolvency into a national psychological crisis.
Right.
What was actually happening on the ground there?
It is a phenomenal case study in the power of semantics and the fragility of public trust. The Bank of the United States was an aggressively expanding commercial institution that catered heavily to the immigrant population in New York.
Specifically the Garment District, right?
Yes. And because of the highly authoritative nature of the name, a vast portion of its depositors legitimately believed it was the official central bank of the federal government.
That is such a crucial detail.
They assumed their deposits were backed by the full faith and credit of the United States Treasury.
Which is a catastrophic misunderstanding when rumors of insolvency begin to circulate. The psychological leap for these people is no longer, oh, my local bank made some bad real estate loans.
Right, it becomes
that the American government itself has run out of money.
Exactly. That cognitive distortion is what amplified the panic and triggered a massive bank run.
So a bank run is basically when everyone panics and tries to pull their cash out simultaneously.
Correct. But the bank doesn't have the cash because, under fractional reserve mechanics, banks maintain only a small percentage of their deposit liabilities as liquid cash in the vault. The vast majority is loaned out.
It's tied up in long-term illiquid assets like mortgages or business loans.
Yes. So if public trust remains intact, the system functions seamlessly. But the moment a critical mass of depositors demands their cash simultaneously, the bank is mathematically insolvent. It doesn't matter how healthy its long-term loans are.
Because they can't pay the people standing in the lobby today.
Exactly. And this introduces systemic risk. Think of systemic risk as one small leak in a pipe that eventually floods and destroys the entire house. When the Bank of the United States faced a run, the panic wasn't just about Marcus and Singer's bad management anymore.
It infected everything.
It metastasized into a localized crisis of faith in the entire financial infrastructure. People started pulling money from perfectly healthy banks, too.
But this brings up a glaring historical question for me. The Federal Reserve was specifically created after the Panic of 1907 to be the lender of last resort.
That was their primary job.
Their entire mandate was to step into situations exactly like this, open the discount window, and flood the system with emergency liquidity to calm the depositors. Yet they practically stood by and watched the Bank of the United States and subsequently thousands of other banks completely collapse. They were so low energy about it. Why was the Fed so paralyzed?
It really was a tragic failure, and it comes down to a theory called the real bills doctrine, which tied their hands.
How did that actually work in practice?
The adherence to the real bills doctrine is perhaps one of the most consequential policy failures in central banking history. In the 1920s and early 1930s, the dominant economic philosophy at the Federal Reserve dictated that money should only be created or loaned against real bills.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning strictly defined, short-term, self-liquidating commercial paper that backed actual physical goods in transit. The theory was that if credit was only tied to actual physical production, inflation would be impossible.
So they were artificially limiting their own power to inject liquidity based on a rigid philosophical rulebook.
Exactly. When the banking panics accelerated, banks desperately needed cash. They had vaults full of assets, government bonds, mortgages, long-term corporate debt. But under the strict interpretation of the real bills doctrine, the Federal Reserve refused to accept those assets as collateral for emergency loans.
They just said no.
They said no. The Fed's governors looked at the crashing banks and determined that the lack of real bills meant the economy simply didn't require more money. They viewed the liquidation of these banks as a painful but necessary cleansing of bad debt from the system.
That is deeply tragic. They essentially prescribed bloodletting to cure anemic patients.
That is the precise argument advanced by monetarist economists like Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz in their seminal work on the monetary history of the United States. They exhaustively documented how the Federal Reserve's failure to act as a lender of last resort allowed the money supply to contract by roughly one-third.
One-third of the money just vanished.
Yes, between 1929 and 1933. The monetarist perspective asserts that the initial stock market crash of 1929 was severe, but it was the Federal Reserve's passive acceptance of these rolling bank panics that transformed a sharp recession into a catastrophic decade-long global depression.
Wow. Speaking of severe initial shocks, we have to look at the people who are desperately trying to ring the alarm bell before the collapse. And this brings us to tale number 4.
Roger Babson.
Roger Babson and the incredible phenomenon of the Babson break. Babson was a highly visible financial prognosticator, and he had been warning about the structural instability of the market for years.
They called him a perma-bear.
Right. The financial establishment generally dismissed him as a perpetual pessimist, just a loser who hated the boom. But then, on September 5, 1929, he delivers a speech at the National Business Conference in Massachusetts.
A very famous speech.
He stands up and declares, "Sooner or later, a crash is coming, and it may be a terrific one." And the market response wasn't a slow, considered reaction over the following weeks.
No, it was immediate.
The market violently dropped 3% that very afternoon. It was so directly correlated to his words that the financial press literally branded it the Babson break.
They named the dip after him.
But what fascinates me is the sheer vitriol directed at him afterward. Major publications and prominent bankers attacked his character. They labeled him unpatriotic for betting against the relentless prosperity of the American economy. And I know the historical debate around Babson's actual culpability is still incredibly fierce today.
It is a deeply polarized academic debate. And looking at the source material, we have to navigate this with total impartiality to understand the conflicting macroeconomic theories. We aren't taking sides here, just presenting the arguments.
Exactly. Let's lay out the opposing frameworks impartially. If we look at the further left-centric or Marxian economic historical perspective, how do they interpret Babson and the crash? What are we seeing in the sources?
From a left-centric structuralist perspective, Babson was entirely vindicated, and the hostility toward him was a defensive reaction from entrenched capital.
The 1% protecting their wealth.
Exactly. Marxian economists argue that the Great Depression was not an accident, but an inevitable structural crisis inherent to late-stage capitalism. In this view, the massive corporate profits of the 1920s were generated through the severe suppression of wage growth.
So the workers weren't making enough money.
Right. The working class, whose labor produced all these new consumer goods, lacked the purchasing power to actually consume them. So to bridge this gap, the financial elite flooded the working class with predatory installment credit.
Buy now, pay later.
Yes. When the left looks at Babson, they argue he correctly identified this unsustainable overaccumulation of capital at the top. The bankers and the elite attacked him because his warnings threatened the speculative party that was generating their immense wealth.
And they were utterly indifferent to the fact that the resulting collapse would overwhelmingly crush the working class.
That is the core of the left-centric argument found in the historical sources.
So in that view, he is a tragic prophet ignored by greedy elites. But the right-centric view, particularly the Austrian school of economics, takes a radically different stance on Babson's speech and the nature of the crash itself. How do they frame it?
The Austrian perspective fundamentally rejects the idea that capitalism itself was structurally flawed. Instead, they argue that the boom of the 1920s was artificially distorted by the Federal Reserve's loose monetary policy earlier in the decade.
Creating a false boom.
Yes, they argue it misallocated capital into unsustainable ventures. Regarding Babson specifically, some prominent Austrian theorists argue that his highly publicized apocalyptic rhetoric actually acted as a destructive self-fulfilling prophecy.
That he essentially talked the crash into existence.
From this viewpoint, markets are fundamentally driven by the subjective valuations of individuals. By inducing a completely unwarranted psychological panic, Babson triggered a stampede. The right-centric argument posits that if prognosticators had not induced a panic, and if governments had completely refrained from intervening in wages and prices afterward, the market would have naturally cleared its malinvestments through a brief, sharp recession.
Rather than spiraling into a systemic, decade-long depression.
Correct.
It is an endless and fascinating debate over whether the system was inherently broken or just psychologically spooked. But we have to zoom out, because the Great Depression was a global contagion.
It absolutely wasn't limited to the United States.
No. And the source material highlights a critical perspective outside the West, the experience of ordinary citizens in Japan during what is known as the Showa Depression. And honestly, the details here are harrowing.
They are very grim.
The Japanese agricultural sector was so severely decimated by the collapse in global commodity prices that rural farmers fell into absolute destitution. The starvation was so acute that communities were reduced to eating wild rabbits.
Which they grimly nicknamed Showa hogs.
Showa hogs. The entire cultural response became encapsulated in the concept of gammon enduring the unbearable with immense patience and dignity. But behind this profound human suffering, there was a massive macroeconomic policy error. Japan made the disastrous decision to return to the gold standard at the absolute worst possible moment.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the international gold standard was the primary transmission mechanism that exported the depression across the globe.
It was the virus carrier.
Exactly. To understand its destructive power during this period, we have to look at the immense constraints it placed on sovereign nations. The gold standard is a fixed exchange rate regime where a country's currency is strictly convertible into a specific static weight of physical gold.
And what does that mean for their central bank?
Under this system, central banks are fundamentally stripped of their ability to enact discretionary monetary policy.
Because their money supply is physically tethered to the amount of shiny metal sitting in a vault somewhere.
Precisely. If a country is experiencing a severe economic contraction today, the textbook modern response is to lower interest rates and expand the money supply to stimulate investment. Make money cheap and easy to get.
Right.
But under the gold standard, if foreign investors lose confidence and begin withdrawing gold from the country, the central bank must actually raise interest rates to defend the currency peg and halt the gold outflow.
So in the middle of a massive domestic crisis where people are starving and eating rabbits, the central bank is actively making money more expensive and harder to get for their own citizens.
It is the ultimate golden fetter. They are forced to implement draconian deflationary policies.
Crushing domestic wages.
Cutting government spending, suffocating credit all just to protect the physical gold reserves. Japan's return to the gold standard in early 1930, right as global demand was collapsing, locked their economy into this brutal deflationary straitjacket.
And that directly exacerbated the horrific conditions in the rural provinces.
Yes. The rigidity of the system is further highlighted when you look at the United Kingdom.
What happened there?
Well, when Britain finally capitulated and abandoned the gold standard in 1931, the immediate effect was a sharp devaluation of the pound sterling. But that devaluation made British exports instantly competitive on the global market.
Making their stuff cheaper for other countries to buy.
Exactly, allowing their industrial sector to recover far faster than nations like France or the United States, who stubbornly clung to the gold peg for years afterward.
The idea that an inflexible adherence to a monetary system could directly result in farmers eating Showa hogs is just a sobering reminder of the real-world consequences of central bank policies.
Life and death.
It really is. Which brings me to tale number 5. We have to look at the absolute sheer chaos of the aftermath in the United States. I want to talk about the political circus that unfolded as the government tried to assign blame.
The Pecora Commission.
The Pecora Commission. And when I say circus, I mean that quite literally. The Senate launches these sweeping investigative hearings to interrogate the titans of Wall Street. And they bring in J.P. Morgan Jr.,
Arguably the most powerful, aristocratic, untouchable banker on the planet at the time.
Yes. He is subpoenaed to testify. The atmosphere is tense. Everyone hates the bankers. And then, in one of the most surreal and bizarre breaches of decorum in American political history, a circus promoter managing the Ringling Brothers Circus sneaks into the Senate hearing room.
With a performer.
With a performer, a woman with dwarfism named Leah Graff. In front of a swarm of press photographers, the promoter literally plops her right onto J.P. Morgan's lap.
Right in the middle of the Senate hearing.
The flashes go off and the image is splashed across front pages nationwide. It's totally wild. Beyond the sheer absurdity of the visual, what was the strategic cultural calculation behind orchestrating a stunt like that?
It was a brilliantly executed, weaponized public relations maneuver designed to shatter the mystique of the financial elite.
To make him look like a joke.
Exactly. The image of the austere, patrician J.P. Morgan Jr., looking completely bewildered with a circus performer on his knee, totally deflated his aura of invincibility. It was the ultimate visual manifestation of intense populist rage.
And the people were furious.
Millions of citizens had seen their life savings vaporized, their farms foreclosed upon, their employment terminated. They harbored a deep, visceral fury toward the Wall Street institutions they held directly responsible for the crisis.
And the Pecora Commission was basically the vehicle for that anger.
Yes. The commission was tasked with channeling that chaotic populist rage into structured legislative reform, and exposing the inner workings of these financial syndicates, bringing them down to earth, was paramount to securing public support for new regulations.
The anger was completely justified when you look at the economic reality on the ground. We've touched on some heavy macro theory today, but we must ground this in the visceral human toll.
The suffering was immense.
The deflationary spiral wasn't just a chart on a wall for an economist. It was the sprawling Hoovervilles. These were massive, wretched shanty towns, constructed out of scrap lumber, tin, and tar paper.
Popping up everywhere.
Erupting right in the middle of Central Park in New York. And along the Anacostia River in Washington, D.C., they were mockingly named after President Herbert Hoover, whose perceived inaction made him the target of immense bitterness.
And out west you had the Dust Bowl.
The apocalyptic reality of the Dust Bowl. A combination of severe drought and catastrophic deep plowing farming techniques caused the topsoil of the Great Plains to literally take flight in massive black blizzards.
It displaced entire communities.
You had millions of displaced agricultural workers, the Okies, loading their emaciated families and worldly possessions onto dilapidated Chevys, crawling westward along Route 66 toward California, chasing rumors of agricultural work that simply did not exist.
It's forever immortalized in Dorothea Lange's heartbreaking photography.
Yes. Her portrait of the migrant mother, Florence Owens Thompson, staring into the distance with a look of profound, exhausted despair while her children bury their faces in her shoulders. She had literally just sold the tires off her car to buy food.
Just devastating.
The deflationary mechanics created that destitution. And I know Irving Fisher, despite his earlier miscall on the crash, he later developed a theory to explain exactly why this downward deflationary spiral was so inescapable.
He did. Fisher's debt deflation theory of Great Depressions remains one of the most vital frameworks for understanding the anatomy of a severe economic contraction. Fisher realized that the devastating core of the Depression wasn't just falling prices.
But was it then?
It was the interaction between falling prices and high levels of nominal debt.
Okay, how does that mathematical trap actually work for the average borrower?
It is a brutal paradox. Imagine a farmer who takes out a $10,000 mortgage when wheat is selling for $2 a bushel. He knows he needs to sell 5,000 bushels to clear the debt.
Simple math.
But when the economic shock hits and the system contracts, the price of wheat collapses to 50 cents a bushel.
Wow.
Now, the farmer's nominal debt remains exactly $10,000. The bank does not lower the principal.
They still want their 10 grand,
Exactly. But in real terms, his debt burden has quadrupled. He now has to sell 20,000 bushels of wheat just to break even.
which he obviously can't do.
Right. So to try and service this massive real debt, the farmer and millions of other producers are forced to liquidate their assets at fire sale prices. This distress selling floods the market with inventory.
Which drives prices down even further.
Exactly. As prices drop, the network of businesses collapses, leading to mass bankruptcies and layoffs. The unemployed stop consuming, demand plummets, prices fall again, and the velocity of money effectively grinds to a halt. Fisher summarized it perfectly.
What do you say?
He said, in a deflationary spiral, the more the debtors pay, the more they owe.
It is an inescapable economic black hole. And the sheer scale of the suffering finally forced a monumental structural response from the federal government.
It brought in the Roosevelt era.
The inauguration of Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1933 brings us the famous first 100 days and the launch of the New Deal. The federal government fundamentally rewrote its social contract with the American public. You have massive, unprecedented public works programs.
The Civilian Conservation Corps.
Right, mobilizing hundreds of thousands of unemployed young men, sending them into rural areas to plant billions of trees and construct state park infrastructure. The Works Progress Administration began pouring concrete for bridges, schools, and hospitals across the nation.
Directly injecting capital into the hands of labor.
But regarding the financial sector, the legislative response was sharp and targeted. We see the passage of the Glass-Steagall Act.
Glass-Steagall was a direct legislative consequence of the abuses uncovered by the Pecora Commission. It legally mandated an absolute firewall between commercial banking and investment banking.
So the banks couldn't gamble with your checking account anymore.
Exactly. Commercial banks, which held the deposits of everyday citizens, were explicitly prohibited from taking those funds and gambling them on the highly speculative securities markets. It aimed to structurally separate the utility of banking from the casino of Wall Street.
But the true silver bullet, the mechanism that actually stopped the bleeding in the banking sector almost instantaneously, was the creation of the FDIC.
The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation.
Right. And the mechanics of how quickly it worked are just staggering.
The FDIC is a testament to the power of restoring psychological trust. As we discussed with the Bank of the United States, banking panics are driven by the fear of individual loss.
People are terrified of losing their life savings.
Yes. So the FDIC implemented a federal guarantee. It insured individual bank deposits up to $2,500.
Which was a lot of money back then.
It communicated to the public that even if their local bank suffered catastrophic losses and closed its doors, the sovereign wealth of the United States government guaranteed their deposits would be returned in full.
And did it work?
The data on its effectiveness is unparalleled. In 1933, before the FDIC took effect, roughly 4,000 banks failed in the United States.
4,000.
In 1934, the first year of FDIC operation, only 9 insured banks failed.
9.
Just 9. The era of the systemic bank run was essentially eradicated overnight, not by physically moving money, but by mitigating the psychological terror of the depositor.
That is a profound turnaround. So what does this all mean? Having navigated these bizarre events, from Livermore's massive short to the Shoeshine Boys' liquidity signal, the semantic failure of the Bank of the United States, the global constraints of the gold standard, and the deflationary black hole, what does this ultimate playbook look like?
It's all about the takeaways.
Exactly. What are the concrete takeaways for the different factions operating in our modern economy? Let's start with the banking and finance sector. The lesson there seems incredibly stark. Liquidity is absolute king.
It is the inescapable reality of finance. You can possess a balance sheet loaded with billions of dollars in theoretical, paper wealth long-term bonds, complex derivatives, illiquid real estate.
But none of that matters in a panic.
If a liquidity crisis hits and you cannot meet the immediate cash demands of your depositors or counterparties on Monday morning, you are insolvent and out of business by Tuesday. Solvency is an accounting concept. Liquidity is a survival metric.
For the traders and the retail investors tuning in, the lesson of Joseph Kennedy rings loudly. Monitor the extremes of market sentiment. When the most uninformed participants in your social circle are aggressively deploying capital into highly speculative assets, you must recognize that the marginal buyer is exhausted.
The smart money observes that saturation and aggressively manages their exit.
Listen to the Shoeshine Boy. Now, what about the politicians and the central policymakers?
For policymakers, the mandate is hypervigilance against systemic contagion. You cannot allow a localized panic, whether it's triggered by an identity crisis at a mid-sized bank or the collapse of a specific asset class, to metastasize into a national crisis of confidence.
Don't let the Bank of the United States take down the country.
Right. The central bank must fulfill its role as the lender of last resort immediately and forcefully. Furthermore, regarding the broader economic landscape, policymakers must resist the political temptation to enact protectionist trade policies during a downturn.
Like the Smoot-Hawley tariff.
Exactly. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, which the U.S. implemented to protect domestic manufacturing, sparked devastating retaliatory tariffs globally. It choked off international trade exactly when global cooperation was most desperately needed.
It was a disastrous trade war.
It served as a classic bigger-than-neighbor policy that impoverished everyone.
And finally, for the gamblers, the aggressive speculators navigating volatile markets. Risk management is the only thing standing between you and total ruin. We marvel at Jesse Livermore orchestrating a $100 million windfall in 1929. He was the undisputed king of the crash.
But the epilogue is tragic.
The tragic epilogue to his story is that his lack of long-term risk management caught up to him. He continued to take heavily leveraged, concentrated positions, eventually losing his entire fortune and ultimately taking his own life while completely bankrupt. Brilliance in market timing cannot compensate for a lack of structural risk management.
Which naturally leads us to forecast how these historical mechanics apply to our current and future economic environment.
Let's look at the short term and the long term.
In the short term, the vulnerability remains centered around modern FOMO. The velocity of information on social media allows speculative manias to build faster than ever before. When we see massive retail participation heavily utilizing margin debt to chase parabolic tech stocks or novel digital assets, the structural fragility is identical to 1929.
The margin debt is the killer.
The market is constantly vulnerable to sudden, violent deleveraging events triggered by an unexpected catalyst.
But the long-term structural architecture is fundamentally different today. The Federal Reserve isn't going to sit back and let the money supply contract by a third because they aren't bound by physical gold anymore.
That is the pivotal distinction. We no longer operate under the severe constraints of the gold standard. We exist in a system of fiat money.
Let's define fiat money for the audience.
Fiat money is currency that is not backed by a physical commodity like gold or silver. The monetary base is highly elastic. Its value is maintained purely by the institutional credibility and decree of the issuing government.
Because the government says it has value.
Because central banks possess this elasticity, they can execute programs like quantitative easing, purchasing massive amounts of assets to flood the system with liquidity and arrest a deflationary bank run spiral before it can take root. The modern central bank balance sheet is a weapon against the kind of catastrophic contraction we saw in the 1930s.
So we have the tools to prevent a starvation-level deflationary depression. But that elasticity introduces a completely different, perhaps equally terrifying risk.
It does. The risk pendulum swings to the opposite extreme. If a central bank consistently relies on massive liquidity injections to solve every localized crisis and perpetually expands the monetary base without corresponding real economic growth, the long-term threat shifts from a deflationary spiral to severe currency debasement.
A hyperinflationary disaster.
Yes. The ultimate danger is a hyperinflationary environment where the nominal value of assets skyrockets, but the purchasing power of the currency collapses entirely.
It's a totally different manifestation of economic disaster. Instead of having absolutely no money to buy a 2-cent loaf of bread, you have a wheelbarrow full of $1,000 bills that still can't buy a loaf of bread because the currency is entirely worthless.
Exactly.
It proves the old adage that while history rarely repeats itself exactly, it always violently rhymes. The crash of 1929 and the ensuing depression stand as the ultimate reality check for human greed, leverage fragility, and the devastating consequences of systemic panic.
It serves as a permanent monument to the complexities of macroeconomic design and the enduring irrationality of crowds. And as we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to examine in your own financial life.
Love it. Lay it on them.
We have deeply explored how a 10-year-old shoeshine boy offering stock tips was the undeniable, flashing red signal that the 1929 bubble was exhausted. What is the exact functional equivalent of that signal in today's highly algorithmic, AI-driven, continuously connected financial world?
That's the real question.
Is it a viral influencer with zero financial background promoting an obscure microcap stock to millions of followers? Is it a decentralized autonomous organization pumping a digital asset based purely on meme culture? Look at the financial environment around you right now. What is the shoeshine boy standing directly in front of you today, demanding your attention that you are actively choosing to ignore?
That is a truly profound question to ponder the next time you open your portfolio app or read a headline about the latest market craze. Thank you for joining us on this exhaustive journey back to the structural failures and the intense human drama of 1929. If you like this talk, please subscribe and like this channel.